Hi there, my name is Salman Shahi and I'm a musician based in Toronto, Canada. This video is part of a series exploring minimalism in the world of Western classical music. So if you're here to gain some insight as to why and how minimalism has become one of the most favorite and popular styles of music, you've come to the right place. So without further ado, let's jump right in. I must admit that as a composer myself, I've always found solace in minimalism, in its texture-focused, meditative, and rhythmically complex structures. I also found it refreshing that it was unapologetically tonal, and it did not try to impress or condescend, as some other aesthetics in contemporary music had tended to do. But a few years ago, when preparing for a talk at a university about minimalism, I had to ask myself, what is minimalism? Well, when it comes to music, minimalism has to fulfill at least three criteria. Repetition of a single motivic or rhythmic idea, slow and irregular pace of change, either a strong focus on timbre, pulse, or both. Now, you can probably find many minimalist pieces that avoid some of these, and yet they're still classified as minimalist, and that's totally acceptable. These are only the most typical features of what we call minimalism. For instance, let's look at this example.
It's gonna rain, it's gonna rain, it's gonna rain, it's gonna rain, it's gonna, 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 it's gonna,
So this excerpt from It's Gonna Rain by Steve Reich, the main focus is solely on the rhythmic manipulation of a single phrase in order to create an illusion of a pulse. It is irregular in its changes, but there's barely any pitch to create a sense of timbre or motif, and yet we still call it a minimalist piece. In fact, a very, very good one. Now, a bit of history about minimalism. Minimalism is a product of a reaction to the avant-garde in the arts, starting roughly in the 60s and 70s, and mostly in the opposite coasts of the United States. One can even call minimalism a truly American contribution to the world of contemporary classical music. A contribution that later was imported and embraced by many composers across the Atlantic, in Europe, and even in Asia. To put it simply, the avant-garde was a reaction itself. A reaction to all things we take for granted, such as tradition, history, and even the very definition of beauty itself. The modern composer in the 20th century objected to these generally agreed upon concepts and raised the point that tradition has led to nothing but war, destruction, and exclusion. They tried to design new systems of creation in which the creator had different roles in the process of creation, using pure mathematics, chance, unconventional sound sources such as objects or electronics. All became fascinating forms of exploration for composers. As it is the case with exploration, the results can vary in terms of popularity, or shall we say accessibility. An average listener in the 19th century at a concert would have heard some Bach and Mozart and Schubert, and to challenge his ear, he would have heard some Ravel and Debussy, which were still deeply immersed in tonality and tradition. Now, an average listener in the 1950s would probably hear something like this. Or this. Or even this. That's right, pure silence. Though an incredibly versatile sound world had just opened up, the audiences were somewhat forgotten and abandoned. The world of contemporary music was in a second adolescent period, and it did not care about legacy or impact. All it cared about was innovation and finding new pathways to expression. And that became a stain on the contemporary classical music that still, unfortunately, affects the image of a composer in the eye of the public. Now, I personally love the composers that I just cited. They're all brilliant minds, and they all have enormous technical capability. And if it wasn't for them, we would be missing so many important pieces of music that paved the way for progress and exploration. But I think we need a little bit more context before we can delve into the world of minimalism. Now, minimalism was a reaction to this reaction. It was a reaction to the so-called elitism and intellectualism that had kind of become part of the contemporary music culture. And also a reaction to the sound world that, in the opinion of many, had lost touch with reality. In a sense, minimalism was an important gateway for serious art music to find its way back to the public. In this video, we will be focusing on two figures who are considered the pioneers of minimalism. The next two videos will focus on some other notable figures. But before we do, let's dig a little deeper into what makes a piece a minimalist piece. Often rapid patterns using consonant sonorities in major or minor keys, slow but highly controlled pace of change, long stretches of monotonous dynamics, emphasis on the interplay of counterpoint, circular and repetitive melodic and rhythmic figures, meditative with a focus on the present as opposed to progression. Minimalism usually falls back on the tonality and counterpoint of the 18th and 19th century. It utilizes musical tools that Bach and Mozart and Brahms would have used, and takes the time to truly stretch them to allow the listener to delve into how these sound waves dance with each other. Later composers also introduced elements of jazz and rock, harmony and counterpoint into the music, which gave their pieces and minimalism an incredibly popular and digestible aura. Steve Reich, one of the most important composers of the 20th century, has had this to say about minimalism. What I'm interested in is a compositional process and a sounding music that are one and the same thing. The use of hidden structural devices in music never appealed to me. For him, and many others, the convoluted and predetermined processes in which the avant-garde composers were creating it did not translate in the actual product that was the piece itself. The music had to be explained or analyzed in order to be fully appreciated. For Reich, he wants to write a piece where the process is part of the experience of the listener, as though the listener is creating with the composer in their subconscious. That is a powerful idea that compelled so many to gravitate towards this way of writing. Yet another compelling factor in minimalism was the meditative element of it. This was largely due to the influence of the composers from the cultures of the Far East, such as Zen and Buddhism. The music drew the ears inwards and focused the mind and the ear on the experience of the sound, and how, though gradually, change was taking place. The seemingly monotonous and simple music was also subject to some pretty harsh criticism by some important composers in the 20th century, such as this one. Perhaps it can be understood as a kind of social pathology, as an oral sign that American audiences are primitive and uneducated. Or this. One also hears constant repetition in the speeches of Hitler or in advertising. It has its dangerous aspect. So as you can see, this was an incredibly controversial way of creating, and by many in the establishment cast as inferior or rudimentary. My hope is that by the end of this series, we can see that minimalism has much to offer the listener, and there's a reason that it has found its way to so many composers who either fully or partially embrace it in their creative process. So where did it all begin? The answer is on the opposite coasts of the United States. First, we have Lamont Young, who's regarded as the first minimalist composer. He was an experimental sound artist in Brooklyn, New York in the 50s and 60s. He was a saxophonist by training, but soon became entrenched in writing, and most importantly, in questioning it. Later in his youth, he also became seriously trained in Indian music, which gave him a deep understanding of rhythm and improvisation. Though much of his music has been underperformed or underpresented, he's famous for some of his works, such as the Theater of Eternal Music and the Walton Piano. Lamont Young explored ideas such as microtonality, drones, and spontaneous improvisation. He was a free spirit who was deeply curious about the nature of sound, and in turn shifted his attention away from the formal structures of Western European music to a more intimate and personal sonic space. Here's just a short excerpt from the Walton Piano, which is a piece that experiments with just tuning. Now, just tuning, in a small nutshell, is an equal division of the octave, as opposed to the tempered or modified division of the octave, which is what we're used to hearing. Now, before I play the first excerpt, please bear in mind that due to the nature of minimalism, these pieces are often very long, and both due to copyright issues and logistics of making the video, I can only share a small fragment of it. But I do encourage you to go and to listen to all these pieces at length. I will make sure to include a link in the description for all of you that want to get out there and listen to this. And here's a bit of the Walton Piano. And here's also a little bit of his Theater of Eternal Music. Now, While Lamont Young was busy with his drones in Brooklyn, we have Terry Riley in California. He's best known for his work for unspecified instrumentation in C. He was a good friend of Lamont, and they collaborated together many times. Also an avid performer, Terry Riley was deeply influenced by jazz and Indian music, which deepened his sense of rhythm and pulse. His most important contribution to the world of music was his 1964 composition in C for an indefinite number of performance. This work consists of 53 short, numbered musical phrases, lasting from half a beat to 32 beats. Each phrase can be repeated a random number of times. Each musician has control over which phrase they play, and players are encouraged to play the phrases starting at different times, even if they are playing the same phrase. In this way, although the melodic content of each part is predetermined, in C has elements of aleatoric music to it. Aleatoric meaning a way of writing in which elements of the music are left to either chance or the choices of the performer at that very moment. It's interesting to note that the premier performers of this piece included people like Steve Reich or Pauline Oliveros, who are both extremely important figures in the world of classical music, which is a testament to his influence and the upcoming generation of composers. Here's a small excerpt. Now remember that literally any collection of instruments can perform this work. This is just one of them. One of the truly revolutionary aspects of this piece was in its instrumentation, or rather lack of it. This was the first instance in the history of music where the composer would fully relinquish control over what instruments would play his work, and instead provide a roadmap for fragments that would come and fill in the puzzles of this piece. Now, this was common practice in the, let's say, Baroque era, where the bass or the basso continuo would be played by either cello or harpsichord or organ, or the melodic lines would be played by either flute or the oboe. But in this case, the composer is entirely letting go of any form of control over the instrumentation. What he accomplished was essentially a piece that can recreate itself every time it's performed. Besides that, he also left the duration of each repeat to the whim of the performer and also encouraged a way of collective listening. He created another opportunity for the piece to regenerate itself every time it's performed. This way of writing also left a great deal of the creative process to the performer and how they deem to interpret the piece in that very moment. So here you have it. We've just covered the basics of what minimalism is, and the first two composers responsible for bringing it to the forefront of the musical scene. This brings us to the end of the first episode, but be sure to tune in next week in our next episode where we'll be discussing the three main figures in minimalism. Also, please be sure to hit the like and subscribe button if you want to be notified about my future uploads. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.